28 minutes, 95th to downtown. Outbound, it's closed right now. Pershing to 43rd. There's a crash blocking everything. That's traffic. I'm Jim Calamonte on AM 560, The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. Your official Chicagoland weather forecast from the 1 Hour Heating and Air Conditioning Weather Center and Steve Williams.
Today, partly sunny, rather chilly. The high today at 29. Partly cloudy, very cold tonight. Low down to 9. A sunny, cold day tomorrow, the high 24. Plenty of sun Friday with a high of 38. I'm Steve Williams on AM 560, The Answer.
17 at O'Hare. Next news at 7:30. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Don't miss the Ruger event at Shoot Point Blank, now through February 23rd. Save on all Ruger firearms, including the Ruger SR9C 9mm, starting at $279.99. Shop the Ruger event, in-store or online at shootpointblank.com.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Well, former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich was all smiles walking through the Denver airport yesterday after learning that President Trump had commuted the rest of his 14-year prison sentence, making his way back to Chicago. And
caught an 8:30 flight out of Denver.
And WGN reporter Julie Unruh missed him terribly, it sounded like. They had a chat while he was walking to his gate.
I want to express my most profound and everlasting gratitude to President Trump. He didn't have to do this. He's a Republican president. I was a Democratic governor. My fellow Democrats have not been very kind to him. They've been very unkind to him. And what he did was, I think, something that deserves a great amount of appreciation on my part personally. And he has, from me, my deepest, most profound and everlasting gratitude. And I can't wait to get home. I miss my daughters, miss my wife. I miss home. He's got obviously a big fan in me. And if you're asking me what my party affiliation is, I'm a Trumpocrat.
Yeah.
It's a broken criminal justice system, and it's an unfair criminal justice system. It's a criminal justice system with too many people who have too much power, who don't have any accountability, and they could railroad people and put innocent people in prison, and they are, generally speaking, virtually always prone to over-sentence people. It's a criminal justice system that's not only broken, but it's also racist. And I saw how it affects people of color, and how on cases with nonviolent first offender drug offenders, that they're made to do decades of prison time for mistakes that they made and wrongs they committed that any fair-minded society would not allow. And
Rod,
so I'll have more to say later.
You said things happen for a reason. Do you believe this happened for a reason?
Yes, I do.
How so?
I just believe that sometimes out of evil, good things can happen. And I think that the wickedness and evil that was done to me and to my family can be turned to good.
And he has a positive attitude. He said he spent a lot of time alone with God in the last 8 years. But there was no contrition. No, I'm sorry for what I did.
Well, no. Evil was done to me and my family.
Yeah.
There was only 2 years ago, Wall Street Journal op-ed, I'm in prison for practicing politics. So at least we didn't have to suffer the apology from the political hack, which we're so used to in this city. He protests his innocence. I don't agree with him, but that's the position he's taken from the outset and continues to take. I just wonder, very concerned about
What?
the inmates in his Shakespeare class. I just want to make sure they get credit for this semester, because I know they hadn't gotten to the sonnets yet. So I want to make sure.
He's going to be missed in prison, trust me. Well,
You can take that a lot of ways.
Well, no, I meant intellectually.
For more on Rod's release, we're pleased to be joined again by Rod Blagojevich, Rod's brother, and author of the book Fundraiser A, My Fight for Freedom and Justice. Fundraiser A, My Fight for Freedom and Justice. Rob, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning to both of you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And I know we've talked about this before, but it recedes into people's memory. You were indicted with your brother initially, hung jury. He was retried. Federal government decided not to attempt to retry you. And I think a lot of people had, including in a media that is not as sympathetic to your brother, which would include me, very sympathetic to you, and do believe that you were used as a way to try and leverage your brother in a way that was illegitimate. You should have never been prosecuted. It's one thing to pressure. It's another thing to actually go forward and indict and inflict the kind of cost that was imposed on you by the U.S. Attorney's Office. I always thought that was wrong. But I think your brother deserved to go to prison, and then we get into the business of what the duration of his sentence should have been. Where are you on that? Was Rod innocent and in prison for practicing politics, or is this a matter of arguing about an appropriate sentence?
Well, I would say that your observations are insightful about what happened with me. And I would say that the government has, as we all know, unlimited power, and they use it only as severely or generously as the individual agendas of those U.S. attorneys, in this case, Patrick Fitzgerald. So they were merciless and, to me, did not represent the best of this country by going after me and wanting me to plea deal to do something against my brother. And then, as you mentioned, they dropped the charges after Rod and I were on trial. The reason they dropped the charges is because I was an effective witness for myself and my brother. And the jury came back hung, and the day of the hearing, to set the date for the next trial, my lawyer gets a call from the lead prosecutor saying that, look, we want to cut a deal with your client. We won't we won't try him with his brother again. We'll consider something for him, but he's got to wait until after his brother has been tried again. And we said no to that, and the next day they dropped their charges on me. So they play chicken with people's lives, and as Rod said in that clip, and he's right about this, there's no accountability back to these people. These are government, righteous, driven people who have no accountability, and that's a real problem. So I would say this: I'm very grateful to President Trump for what he's done for Rod and his family, and Rod definitely has a lot of work to do to get back with his girls and make up for 8 years. And
do you think your brother is a man without a party now? I mean, is he? What do you think his political leanings are going to be?
Yeah, good question. I can't speak to that. As you may or may not know, I haven't spoken with Rod since right after he was convicted. We had been estranged for reasons that had to do with how we were preparing to go to trial that first time, and we were very unaligned in what was important and what mattered in preparation for trial. And so that created a real issue for us, and there are personal issues between the two of us. But I love my brother. Mm-hmm. I want nothing but the best for him and his family. And so whatever his political affiliation might be, that should be the least of his concerns or anyone's concerns. He needs to kind of rebuild his life and rebuild his relationship with his family. That's first and foremost, and I hope he does that.
Do you think that whether you want to characterize what he did during his tenure as criminal or just errors in judgment, do you think he is self-accountable for the decisions that he made as governor?
He's accountable for his actions. There's no question about that. And I would say that anytime the government, as they did with us, wiretap you for 50 days and compile hours and hours of undisciplined conversations like we all have all the time, they can make a federal case out of it, which is what they did with Rod. I'm not going to comment on his guilt or innocence. He's paid a big price. Mm-hmm. So in my view, this is over. He needs to go rebuild his life. But the lessons that I know he learned, and I know I learned, and I thank you for mentioning my book, because I wrote about that as a first person sitting in this courtroom the size of a basketball court, overwhelmed by the resources of the federal government in a David and Goliath battle, that you only have a 4% chance of walking away with your freedom. I got lucky. I had the resources. I was innocent, and oftentimes that's not enough. And so with regard to my brother, guilty or innocent, he's paid a big price. Whether he admits anything or not, obviously that's his choice. He's going to have to reflect on that and live with it. But he needs to get on with his life and rebuild his family life, most importantly.
Is there anybody in this saga that wasn't held accountable other than, in your opinion, the federal prosecutors? But I'm talking about in terms of politicians or political operatives. Anybody that wasn't held accountable that should have been by law enforcement?
Man, that's a wide open question. And the first name
Sure
that
is.
comes to my mind is a name that you may or may not remember, John Wyma, who worked for Rod for many years. He was with Chuck Schumer when Schumer was in Congress, came over to work with Rod when Rod was in Congress. He was being followed and was going to be charged by Patrick Fitzgerald, the U.S. attorney, for things that he was doing on the side that were allegedly illegal. And so he copped a plea, and he pled against his friend to get off and to take care of himself, which is what the system is built to do. And as Alan Dershowitz has said, the government gets people to compose, which means they get them to say things that sound right and twist the facts to get an outcome that they seek. And so Wyma was very expedient, took care of himself, didn't care about anyone else, and he's been a free man. I would say, though, in terms of in general, and this is kind of the DNA of politicians. Rod, when he was arrested, and he and I were talking quite often and trying to support each other at that time, the astonishing thing to me was nobody in his party there ever reached out to him. It was the rats were jumping off the ship, making sure they've got their stuff, and covering their back so they don't get swept up in the storm.
Well, that's what happened.
That to me is a real lesson.
And what about J.B. Pritzker?
Lesson.
I mean, we talked yesterday about J.B. Pritzker. He was seeking to have Barack Obama's U.S. Senate seat, and he didn't support
that guy. He's a low character guy who's from a wealthy family and has a lot of money, and he was able to get elected. He was wiretapped with Rod, asking Rod for the Senate seat, and that was, I know, played during his election for governor. But what people don't know is he was supporting Rod when Rod first ran for Congress and won in the 90s. And I happened to be at the celebration that night. I came up to support my brother, and I met JB, and Rod said, this guy's rich and he wants to get into politics, and he's kind of becoming my friend. And so then you fast forward, he gets elected, and now he's saying that Rod hasn't been punished enough. I mean, my God, where's the mercy? Where's the decency? Shame on J.B. Pritzker and all the others in that Democratic Party and the Republican Party, because it's not about what's right and wrong. If you think Rod's guilty, fine, but 8 years for taking no money or hurting no one is penalty enough, really over penalty for what he allegedly had done. And there's no humanity from these people. All they care about is raising money, enriching themselves, and selling pablum, whether it's a Democratic pablum or a Republican pablum, to the public to raise money and contain their power.
Well, that's
a really sad thing.
Yeah, and I mean, and you probably learned this from your short time in Illinois politics, that this is how crime families work. You see it on the silver screen, and that's what we have here. Both parties operate as crime families. So I know it was a crash course, but yeah, those on the ground have observed this for some time. It's just that voters seem to like this for some reason here. What you mentioned, J.B. Pritzker. What about some of the others that were involved in the discussions about the Senate seat? The Rahm Emanuels of the world, and anybody potentially from the Obama White House. A lot of interest in the 302s, the FBI fact sheets with respect to some of these other well-known names in Chicago politics that seem to have skated on everything related to Rod Blagojevich.
Well, you throw, for sure, Rahm Emanuel, the tiered justice system. I mean, the guy is a protected elite who has friends in the DOJ, of course, a connection with the Clintons. And there's no way a guy like that is going to be blemished or put in harm's way. And I remember reading his 302, getting ready for trial, and reading along very avidly about the chain of questioning. And then when it came to Rod and reaching out to Rod and asking Rod to save his seat because he was going to go work for Obama for a while, if I remember correctly, and so that Rod could reappoint him. And Rod told him, "No, I can't do that because I don't think I have that power." And then when the prosecutor started asking, or the FBI agent started asking Emanuel about specific things related to Rod, they took a break. The tape was stopped, the recording was stopped, and they resumed and followed a completely different line of questioning, which, as I was getting ready for trial, I had to worry about myself, but I read that because I thought I needed to be aware of it. But now I can talk about it. And you can also throw in there Jesse Jackson Jr., who sent emissaries to me, which I wrote about in my book. One offering $1.5 million, the other offering $6 million if Rod would appoint Jackson to the Senate seat. Now, I know the Reverend and his son, Jr., came out in support of Rod some months ago. That's very nice. And I know Jesse Jr. went to prison for stealing campaign funds, but he's never been held accountable for wanting to buy the Senate seat. Yeah. And I even went to Washington and spoke to the House Ethics Committee when he was still in office. And I told them everything I could remember from the 302s that I read, which were fairly detailed, and nothing ever happened to him with regard to what he tried to do, buy a Senate seat, which, just for your listeners, everything I'm reading here is saying that Rod was convicted of trying to sell Barack Obama's Senate seat. All those charges were dropped on appeal because he was not trying to sell a Senate seat. People came to me trying to buy it, but we said no. And that's a narrative that's just gotten twisted over the years, and I'm really grateful to you, to both of you, for giving me a chance to speak about that a little bit. So those are the two people that I say skated big time with regard to our legal ordeal.
Now, once the dust settles, do you hope to make amends with your brother sometime soon?
You know, I haven't spoken to him for, I don't know, 8 years. 8 years. I reached out to him, called him, estranged from his family. It's a sad thing. We went through a very stressful time, different philosophies on how to deal with the biggest problem of our lives. As I've said numerous times, I love my brother. I want nothing best for him, and if we can be reunited as brothers somehow, that'd be great. But right now, he's got to focus on his family and rebuild those relationships.
How would you characterize you mentioned sort of the part of the narratives in the media. How would you characterize the Chicago Press Corps' coverage of this saga over the last, decade?
Great question. First, I'll say extremely sympathetic for me once I testified. And you have no idea what kind of feedback I got from some of the crusty people who've been covering the Dirksen Federal Building for their entire careers. That was very uplifting, and I felt good going into the verdict after the jury rested. I felt very confident. Unfortunately, it was hung. But with regard to Rod, that's inside baseball. That's big boy politics. However they treated Rod, they probably had every right to do. He's a public person. But I will say this: over the years, even when I went up for Rod's resentencing some years ago, when Judge Zagel was still on the bench, I sat in the courtroom, and all the local press that covered our case were sitting behind me. And once the judge reinstituted the 14-year sentence, both in the courtroom and on the way down in the elevator, to a person and a woman said, "This is wrong. It's just too harsh. He's been punished enough." So, I got to say that overall there was responsibility in how they reported things, and also a compassion and humanity that they realized that Rod may have been overpunished by the system. And therefore, again, I say I'm very grateful to the president for seeing that and doing the right, compassionate, humane thing for my brother and his family.
I just want to go back to your brother and sort of his circle of influence and the people that were around him during his time in power. I mean, you had Chris Kelly. People forget some of these names. You mentioned John Wyma. Chris Kelly was a friend and fundraiser, also indicted during that period, committed suicide. The Tony Rescos of the world. Rod chose to surround himself with some questionable individuals, and I wonder if there has been, in your conversation with your brother over the years before you were estranged, some recriminations about the judgment calls that he made in politics in Illinois.
Well, I remember a conversation Rod and I had well before anything happened to us. Chris Kelly was just indicted for income tax evasion. He had sheltered income through his business, and ultimately was discovered and charged, and told Rod, who passed on to me, again, this is second, third hand, that he did that. He was wrong. He was going to man up and face the punishment. And then he was indicted 2 other times, all the while trying to get him to flip on Rod, which he refused to do. And ultimately, after having 3 federal indictments on him, he committed suicide because it was too much. So I would say my brother's judgment in people and who to trust is abysmal. And he listened to the wrong people. He did not take, in my opinion, advice from people who had no agenda other than to serve him as the governor of the state. And so to me, that's the biggest reflective lesson learned that I can offer. He just surrounded himself with yes men who just didn't challenge him.
He is Rod Blagojevich, brother of former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, released yesterday per the president's commutation. Also, check out his book if you want to sort of reflect back on the decade that was in Illinois politics now that Rod has been released. Fundraiser A is the book, My Fight for Freedom and Justice. Rob, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your generosity with your time.
Well, thank you both for the invitation. Have a good day.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer, who's responsible for this great economy? President Obama, President Trump. Will begin there with Stephen Moore. But now, let's head into that newsroom. Here is Mike Scott.
16 degrees at 7:29 on AM 560, The Answer. And President Trump commutes the prison sentence of former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich.
He'll be able to go back home with his family after serving 8 years in jail. That was a tremendously powerful, ridiculous sentence, in my opinion.
The disgraced former Illinois governor is back in Chicago this morning, swarmed by reporters as he arrived at his Ravenswood Manor home.
Rod, what's your plans tonight? Kiss my wife and my daughter. How good does it feel to be home right now, Rod? No place